Okay, in today's video, I'm going to talk about ratings for findings, recommendations, and audit reports. Now, I know for many people, most people probably in internal audit use some sort of ratings on their findings, recommendations, and audit reports. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the reasons to do it, but also some of the reasons maybe why you should consider not doing it. And each person is different, each organization is different. But I just want to go through and talk about a few of the different reasons, maybe why you should and why you shouldn't, and how some people use them, things that you should be considering. Now, one of the chief audit executives that I work with kind of asked me this question in an email, and it's one of those that you can't just respond back in an email with the answer. So I'm putting together this video for their benefit, but also for the benefit of everybody else. And so, first off, let me kind of set the stage a little bit. Those of you in internal audit probably know, what I'm talking about here, but let me just explain a little bit more to make sure that we're clear when I'm talking about this topic. So typically when we do an audit report, there are certain findings or recommendations that we may have as part of our audit. And then we issue an audit report, which is kind of the totality of all of, what we found and any recommendations and findings. So first off, it's important to kind of distinguish, at least the way I use the words, what recommendation means and what a finding means. Because some people use different words. So I just wanted to define those up front. So typically a finding is something where things are supposed to be a certain way and they're not, right? So for example, it could be the criteria that you're basing it on, could be a regulation, it could be a law, it could be a policy or procedure. And so what we're doing in a finding is we are notifying management that things are not the way they are supposed to be. And so findings are typically things that need to be corrected. Hey, we found out that we're not following this law the way that we're supposed to. We found deviations in policy that need to be corrected, different things like that. So in general, findings are more important, if you will. They're things that need to be corrected. Recommendations, on the other hand, are usually areas for opportunity that we have noticed as part of our audit. So maybe we have noticed an area where they could maybe be more efficient or more effective if they, made these changes to the process and incorporated some of the recommendations that we're giving. So in general, findings are things that should be corrected. Recommendations are take it or leave it, right? These are recommendations that we have. We would suggest that you do. If you do them, if you don't do them, it's up to you, right? But again, it's us just notifying management of things that have gone on. And so that's kind of the difference in what I'm talking about today between a recommendation and a finding. Now, on the audit reports, again, usually an audit report is the culmination of everything. It explains the work that we did, and it usually lists out the different recommendations and findings that we had as part of our work. And so when I'm talking about ratings today, a lot of people will put some sort of a rating on recommendations, on findings. Some people actually do a rating on the audit report itself. And so that's really kind of what I want to talk about today is some reasons to do it and maybe some reasons not to do it, and give you a little bit more information about what we see in practice so that you can determine what you want to do in your internal audit activity. Okay, so the first thing is ratings are helpful in being able to prioritize our work. And so, one of the reasons why people put ratings on their recommendations and findings is there's a requirement in the standards that we're supposed to follow up on findings and recommendations that we have given as part of the audit. And so obviously those things that we deem to be more critical, higher risk, things like that, are ones that we want to follow up on more regularly than maybe something that is low or not a priority, right? And so it helps us to prioritize the work that we're going to do afterwards. It also helps management be able to prioritize which of those things they should work on first. Okay. And so, how people do that, it varies. It can be as simple as, think about it as a scale. Okay. So I suggest usually a 3 to a 5 scale, meaning something as simple as high, medium, low, which is a 3-step scale that uses high, medium, and low. But you could use any other words that you want to use in place of high, medium, and low. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. So a lot of people will use a 3, 4, or 5 scale in determining what their ratings are. Now, I personally like a 4-step rating. And the reason for this is there is a general tendency for us to put things in the middle. And so on a 3-step scale, medium would be the middle, right? On a 5-step scale, there's a middle. I like 4-step scale because it requires us to say it's above average or it's below average instead of just taking the easy way of saying, well, it's just average. Okay. Now, again, that's just my personal preference. That's what I used when I was chief audit executive, but you can choose whatever you want, right? 3, 4, or 5 scale is usually best. You could go all the way up to 10. But then you start getting kind of a little too, what makes a 7 versus an 8, or what makes a 6 versus a 5, right? When you get too many scale in the rating scale, it gets a little confusing and it gets harder to be able to put things into specific buckets. Okay. So, and with that scale, again, you're going to want to use words that are familiar to the organization. And so obviously high, medium, and low is something easy that most people can understand. But for example, if your organization uses a different scale, like, significant, moderate, low, then maybe you should consider using significant, moderate, and low instead of high, medium, low, right? And so you'll want to take a look at what is kind of the common practice in your organization and use words that are familiar with other people. Now, when it comes to the words as well, you want to probably make sure that you're not using words that are charged, words that can get people upset as well, right? And so sometimes words like critical and urgent and significant can sometimes in your organization give the wrong perception. And so you just want to kind of consider what words you're using and what words are going to be best in your culture and context for your organization. And like I said, the easiest way to do that is to, maybe look at some other areas in your organization that are using ratings like this and see what they're using. So for example, if you have a project management office, well, a project management office, a PMO, usually has the equivalent of recommendations and findings in their work. So what scale are they using, right? Are they using a 3-step, a 4-step, a 5-step scale? What words are they using, right, that management is used to seeing? Because, again, a lot of times the more common language that we speak, the better. And so if there's already an established guideline for what the words are and what those words mean, it's often best if we can just use that, just piggyback off of what's already being done. Now, with ratings, one thing that should be done is you should create what's called a domain rating. And if you're not familiar with that, I'll explain it a little bit. And you can always, type domain rating probably into Google, and it'll show you. But let me share how that came about, how I started using it, how we started developing it. So at one of my companies where I was chief audit executive, we hired someone who actually had been a middle school teacher. She was, I think it was English. She'd been a middle school English teacher for many years, and went back to school and got her master's in accounting. And then we hired her into internal audit. And so she had a background in education. And one thing that she taught me was about this concept of a domain rating. And so, typically, if you're a teacher and you're grading people, which ratings are kind of like grades, okay, you need to be consistent or know what each letter grade means, what an A is, what a B is, what a C is. And so, in theory, in education, the simplest way that people do it is by taking percentages, right? Your percentages or total points that the student has earned divided by the total number of points available gives you a percentage. And so in a lot of organizations, 90% or higher is an A, 89 to 80 is a B, as an example, right? And so that's a very simplistic way, kind of in teaching a course on how you can determine what's an A, what's a B, what's a C, what's a D, what's an F. Okay. Now it gets a little more tricky when you are doing things like essays. And so this idea of a domain rating really comes up, especially when there are multiple people who are grading essays. And so, as an example, if you take, for example, college entrance exams in the US, a lot of times there is an essay that's required. Now, the same person doesn't actually grade every single one of those. They divide them up amongst many different people. And so they have to level set and explain, how many points a student earns based on the essay. And so they come up with a domain rating, which means, you get a certain number of points if the student addressed this, and a certain number of points if they address that, and a certain number of points if they address this other thing, right? And so it ends up being kind of a scale. Think of it like a matrix, to where there are certain criteria, and depending on how it's scored in the different criteria, the student gets a certain number of points. And so we took that concept and we utilized it in how we decided or did our ratings. And so there were different criteria that we had, like, when we were doing an audit report rating, an overall audit report rating, some of the criteria we had were things like how many findings were there? Well, if there was 0 to 2, then they scored a certain number of points. If there were 3 to 5, then they scored a different number of points. If it was more than that, right? And so that way we could go back and very objectively say, well, this report earned a needs improvement, right? Because that was how it was graded. And we graded everybody consistently. Because again, that's an important thing. If you're going to use ratings, you need to make sure that they are being consistently applied across all of the work that you're doing. Because if you don't, right, you're not being objective, you're not being fair to the people that you're working with. And it also makes it easier for when people disagree with your ratings, because this happens quite often. In fact, one of the reasons for not doing the ratings is ratings are one of the things that are the biggest point of contention in trying to issue an audit report. And I'll get into that here in a little bit as to why that's the case and how we can kind of avoid some of that. But anyway, that's kind of what a domain rating is. And so you're deciding, what those things are going to be, what the words are, and exactly what the words mean by giving them criteria. Now, you have a choice to be able to use ratings for recommendations, for findings, for audit reports, or for none of them, or a combination of them, right? Because again, that's something you can do. I think for a lot of people, recommendations don't necessarily need a rating because it's a take it or leave it, right? Findings, on the other hand, some of the urgency about it, because, for example, if you're doing a domain rating on findings, maybe one of the criteria would be how quickly this thing needs to be addressed, right? If it's something that needs to be immediately addressed or within 30 days, maybe it scores a certain way. If it's something that can be done within 6 months, or if it's something that can be done within a year, you see how there's a difference in how we would prioritize following up with those things and how management should also prioritize which things they're going to work on. Because again, if management gets an audit report, right, or gets the schedule of findings, they need to be able to prioritize which things to work on first, which things are of highest priority. And so that's what some of the ratings end up helping us do. Okay. Now, one of the side effects to doing ratings is often they are the biggest point of contention. And so let me explain why. Is, especially in the United States, I don't know if it's other places as well, but, when you think about education in general, we use letter grades in most of our education system. A is the top, B, C, D, and F. Okay. And with that, in the old days, the way it worked was it was based on a bell curve, which means that, only about 5 or 10% of the people got an A, 15% of the people got a B, most of the people, 60%, got a C, because C is average. And there's nothing wrong with being average per se. Now, what's happened over time is there's been great escalation in the United States, which means everybody now expects to get an A or a B. And so if you get a C, a lot of people feel like they're failing. Okay. Well, that translates over into audit ratings and report ratings as well. So if you have a manager that you're effectively giving an average rating to, often they feel like that's not good enough. Even though, again, we understand statistically 60 to 70% of everything is average. And so a C or an average is just fine, right? It's when you get into the D and the F area that that's a problem. But like I said, because that has been ingrained in a lot of people, people will fight. And so, for example, if you have a 5-step scale, which is very similar to the A, B, C, D, and F in education, if you give somebody a C, if you give them the middle, if you give them an average, they're going to fight and say, no, I'm better than that. I need to be a B, right? And so having the domain rating is a good way for you to be able to say, well, I understand your concern, but based on this, right, you can look at the objective criteria and this is what you scored. And so I had that several times in my career where, the responsible manager in the area would come in, would argue with, the findings. And sometimes we were doing audit report ratings too, and would argue with me about, no, I deserve something better. But I could pull out the domain rating and actually show him or her, well, this is why we gave it to you. We're treating you the same as everybody else. It just so happened that that's how you scored, right? And so having that domain rating is actually a very good thing for you to be able to justify your actions, but also to help you be more objective, right? So that instead of, oh, hey, I really like this manager, so I want to give them an A, but if the domain rating shows they deserve to be, right, it forces us to be more objective. Instead of allowing our own opinions to get in the way, it forces us to give them the grade, if you will, that they really deserve. Okay. Now, another reason why sometimes ratings are maybe not such a good idea is sometimes management will actually include audit ratings in the person's bonus or performance calculation. And so when that happens, all of a sudden you can start to have some unintended consequences, which means not only are people, going to fight for a higher grade just in general, but if their compensation or their performance evaluation is actually based on what you're giving them, they're going to fight even harder. And instead of, that causes problems, like I said, because the managers will fight more. Audit is more concerned about the ratings that you're actually giving because you realize that it has a direct financial impact on the manager as well. And so for that reason, I don't necessarily agree with or encourage people to do ratings on the reports themselves. Okay. And I did. At my first company where I was CAE, we did actually do a report rating. But after a while, in talking with the CFO especially, decided that instead of just doing one, we would do two ratings on each report, right? One that kind of related to the control and compliance side of it, right? Related to kind of the findings themselves versus the recommendations. Because when I first set this up, we were including recommendations and findings the same. And so let's say, for example, that this one audit had 10 recommendations, which, again, recommendations are usually take it or leave it, and they had two findings. But the way we were grading them was the same as if they had 12 findings, right? Which, again, was my bad. And so when we found this out and we were looking at it, we ended up coming up with a 2-tier rating system for the audit reports. And that worked better, but it wasn't perfect either. And so that's why at the next company where I was chief audit executive, we just stopped doing audit report ratings. Now, we did still do ratings on the findings because, again, that helped to provide us as internal audit in knowing how and when we should follow up on these findings. But it also provided information for management so they could prioritize which things to work on first. And so I still felt like that doing ratings on findings was a good thing, but we stopped doing them on recommendations and we stopped doing them on the audit reports. Now, that's just me. That's what was working for me. What, hopefully after listening to this video, it just starts to give you some things to question, maybe some things to understand or to look at how you're doing things. And are there ways that you could do it better? Right. So, as an example, are you getting a lot of pushback on every audit that you issue? If you are, right, maybe one of the ways to reduce that pushback is by changing how you're doing ratings. If you're doing ratings of the audit reports themselves, do you still need to continue doing ratings of the reports themselves? I don't know. Each context is going to be different. And I'm not telling you not to do it because people are arguing with you. But if you're getting arguments most of the time, maybe there's a different way that you could do it to still be effective without having the fighting that goes on, right? And like I said, look at what your organization is doing in other areas. I mentioned before, PMO is one of the areas you can look to. If you're a publicly traded company, how does your SOX team, do things? And again, some of those are kind of based on the law, but a significant deficiency versus a material weakness versus, some of these other terms that may be used. Maybe that's, again, a way of doing it. I don't know. But hopefully, again, you can start asking some questions about, well, do we need ratings on recommendations? Well, if we're never going to follow up on the recommendations, then you may not need them, right? The findings, because we're supposed to follow up on those and we're supposed to help management prioritize which things to fix first, maybe you still do ratings on those. On the audit reports themselves, again, you have to decide what's best for you. I know some companies like to have those because they feel like it's an easier way to know which audits to report to the board and which audits to say, oh, they were okay. Don't need to talk about them, right? And so there's a benefit for doing it that way. But like I said, each organization is different. And so we just encourage you to, go back, start asking your questions about why you're doing things the way you're doing them. and see, maybe it's as simple as just changing the words that you're using in your ratings. Maybe that'll help fix some of the stuff. I don't know. But anyway, hope that was helpful. Like I said, I just wanted to kind of share some things that had worked for me, and also kind of let you know what other people are doing as well. Because I know sometimes, again, it's the idea of, well, what words do I use? Well, again, lots of people use different words. You could use high, medium, low. You could use not significant, significant, urgent, right? There's lots of different words that you can use, but the main point is to use words that aren't so charged and words that are more familiar with what your organization is already used to seeing as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and thanks for listening.